So there were a couple of topics that I wanted to talk about today. I don't know if I'll talk about both of them, but there's, if not today, then one today and one in the next satsang. And one of the topics is to move past the notion of what we should do and how we should act in life. And opening up to a capacity to question what we might be doing in each moment, like doing what we feel like, realizing that we're stuck in a maybe stuck within a rigid idea of how we have to be in life, without even realizing it. And one of the questioners that called in one of the previous satsangs, I think it was 2 satsangs ago, I think it was Erica from memory, was talking about honesty and questioning even the notion, oh, I should be honest. And how I heard what she was saying, I might have misinterpreted it, but even if I did misinterpret it, there is a great insight in someone questioning, do I even need to be honest in life? Is honesty just because it has been, or let's say just because it is a good trait, a trait that maybe leads into less problems than dishonesty, or has different outcomes to dishonesty, because of those reasons society will value it and say we should be honest. And then we can have this idea about ourselves based on that, which is really an attachment to pleasure, because obviously being ideal, being perfect, being saintly, we assume will give us more good than bad, more pleasure than pain. And so we set up this expectation for ourselves. We set up this ideal. And that can become a deeply ingrained attachment, a deeply ingrained expectation, a deeply ingrained belief and concept about who we should be. And if we then don't meet that expectation, it will feel like we are not complete. So even an ideal that seems very noble, I should be honest, unless we see that in principle, this setting up of a benchmark that essentially means we're pigeonholing ourselves, we're putting ourselves in, we're building our own prison, essentially, by setting up a standard that we may not be able to meet. And then if we don't meet it, we have reason based on that standard to feel inadequate. And so the dropping of those shoulds and shouldn'ts might not make sense to us at first, because we think that our happiness is to be found in the outcomes, in the pleasure of whatever might come by us achieving this perfection, the more pleasure that will come from that. And so it might not seem like it makes sense to drop that ideal. The reason the ideal is there is because we're convinced that our happiness will be found through achieving that ideal. And as we start looking at what our unhappiness is, and one of the forms of unhappiness is expectation, which leads to disappointment when when it doesn't turn out that way. It leads to self-judgment about not having performed or lived up to a certain standard. And as we start seeing this, it might become apparent that this standard that we thought was noble and ideal and going to lead to my happiness is actually the cause of my unhappiness. And as we look at that more and more, and maybe realize that not only is it, realize that even these supposedly or seemingly positive strivings are in and of themselves obstacles. And so it can be liberating to realize that's an obstacle, and then maybe realize or see how it can fall away. And that just means getting our head around the fact that maybe I don't have to be that in order for everything to be okay. And if we see that in principle, see that these ideals have been set up and that they are actually unquestioned ideas that make up part of the conceptual structure, the conceptual me, without us even realizing it. It's just assumed to be what we should do. And if this gets seen in principle, it could be the beginning of seeing a whole part of the landscape that was previously out of sight. And that really is what insight is. Seeing something that we didn't realize was an obstacle. And once we see something in principle, we can then start to see in how many different manifestations that same principle holds up. And so one of the core concepts in the teaching is in each moment do exactly what you think or feel to do. It's encouraging us to drop away from how we should or shouldn't live life. This notion of I should do this, I shouldn't do that is very much linked to the idea that life needs to turn out this way. So the notion that life needs to turn out a particular way, and us having this expectation of a particular next moment, a particular way life manifests in the next moment, is in a way the opposite, or obscuring an understanding that everything is happening according to God's will. With the understanding that actually life can only unfold one way, the way that is inevitable, the notion of saying I should act a particular way starts to be seen as, oh, that is me saying I know how life should turn out. And that is according to my will. I'm saying I should act, I should perform in the next moment according to my will. And until we see this, the shoulds and shouldn'ts continue to seem to make sense, and they continue to essentially obscure a being that is in line with everything is happening according to not my will. Everything is happening according to God's will. Everything is unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. So if someone says to me, what should I do in this situation? I'll always revert back. I think you should do what you think or feel to do. Which, to me, understanding that the way we function is a result of the circumstance we're in, and a thought arising or a feeling arising within our body-mind organism according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning and according to the circumstance we're in. And then a movement happens and we don't know what that movement is. So by someone saying, what should I do in this situation? If I say, oh, what you should do is this, and I really believe that fully, or what you should do is this, I'm sort of saying, I know how life needs to turn out. And the truth is, I don't know how the next moment is destined to turn out. So if someone says, what should I do in this situation? I will answer it one of two ways. One is, in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do, which really is giving someone permission to function anyway. So you're not prescribing a particular course of action. It's just saying, well, you will function one way. Or I could answer it by saying, well, if it was me, or if we look at the situation this way, choosing that option has these benefits, potentially, these theoretical benefits and these theoretical downsides. So really just describing the potential consequences or results of doing something versus something else, which is really just information. And then from that place of information, I might say, well, I would choose A. However, it's your choice. You are not, I am not you. So I say I would choose, this course of action, but that's based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, my preferences, my priorities, my assessment of the situation. And at the end of the day, you're a different person. So by doing that analysis, all that's really happening is new information is being thrown in so that it becomes part of the mix. And so really our attitude in our own life, the psychology that's going through our head ideally starts to reflect more and more the notion that life will turn out one way. I am going to function one way, not necessarily the best way, but according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. If we see that putting in on these expectations is adding in a psychological ideal that we may not actually be designed to fulfill. And if we then appreciate that maybe I've been living my life from these shoulds and shouldn'ts, and if we look at it, we see that is what makes me so uncomfortable with myself. Maybe living through shoulds and shouldn'ts creates a disconnection from a more authentic movement that can happen. And it takes a bit of, well, from one perspective we can call it bravery, because it's a challenge to what we have always assumed is the best, going to give us the best outcome. And so it requires us to have motivation or reason to break a habit. And from another perspective, it's got nothing to do with bravery, because the movement to do things differently comes when we start to realize that the old way is actually delivering an outcome that is not in our benefit. And so that means that realization starts to tip the balance, where we realize, oh, in theory, I've always thought that doing, what society wants or what I've been told is important is bound to be good for me in life. And as we start to see, but that's what's making me feel trapped. That's what's making me feel like I have no freedom in life. That's what's making or preventing me from maybe doing something that I have passion for. So if we start to see that, then in time, we will choose to take a risk, to do it differently. And it's not, it can't really be described as, oh, I'm being brave, because we start to see that the old way isn't serving us. So really the new way becomes a movement that is for our benefit. So going back to the realization that I think the caller was putting forward, I don't even need to be honest. Now, that's not a suggestion for people not to be honest. And I don't even think it was the caller saying, I am now going to be dishonest. But it's more realizing, drop the insistence on function on being a certain way, and see what happens. And that doesn't mean, we think that, if I drop my attachment to being honest or my shoulds, then I will function in the opposite. If I drop my I should be honest, then I'll be dishonest. And in practice, it doesn't work like that. If we drop the I should be honest, we're then going to function one way. And that one way could be honesty. But it will be honesty that is authentic from our design, rather than honesty from I should be. And even if if we drop our shoulds and shouldn'ts and then we act honestly, someone might say, then there's no change, because I was acting honestly from I should act honestly. And if I dropped the I should act honestly, then I continued to naturally act honestly, and nothing's really changed. I would say actually there's a huge change. The action might have been the same. However, the attitude from where that action came from is radically different. And that means that the person's experience is on an attitudinal level free. Now we need to reconcile with the fact that the outcomes or the consequences of us functioning differently may not be the same as before. That makes sense. Is like if we always said yes to what other people wanted from us, there's a certain consequence. And then if we realize I don't have to say yes. Who says I have to say yes? Who says I have to agree? And we realize I don't have to say yes. And we might get this sense of excitement, this sense of freedom. Wow, I've never actually realized that I can say no. And then when we realize this and we realize we haven't, we go, I am going to say no when I don't feel like something. But then the thought comes in, but what will happen if you say no? Then these people won't like you. And so we get worried about, oh, I can't have that. And then it's important for us to see that is an attachment to outcome. That is us assuming that our happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And unless freedom or peace or a comfortableness with oneself becomes the priority, unless that is actually, that's what I'm really looking for, that's where my happiness in life is going to be found. Unless that happens, it won't make sense to let go of our shoulds and shouldn'ts, because we'll see the potential consequence, and our conclusion will be, no, that doesn't make sense. I better stick to my current strategy. And the current strategy is, I should do it this way because that will give me the best outcomes, circumstantial outcomes, which really, as hopefully many of you have started to see or have seen for some time, that outcomes are on the level of pleasure and pain, and our peace and our happiness comes from a disidentification or a detachment from seeing our happiness in outcomes and finding a new ground in which we can rest, a new ground in which we can feel a sense of fulfillment and groundedness, irrespective of the outcome. And that requires us to prioritize that attitude ahead of perfecting outcomes, ahead of getting pleasure, 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 pleasure. So the reason why that is a topic, in each moment do exactly what you think or feel to do, as opposed to living life through a whole deep set of deeply ingrained shoulds and shouldn'ts, which often come from our conditioning, up-to-date conditioning in life, shoulds and shouldn'ts from society, from parents, from school, from the political situation or religious situation that we find ourselves in. The reason that the teaching says in each moment do exactly what you think or feel to do is because it's changing the narrative around from life should look this way to life will be one way. Now society is telling us life should be this way. Now that's the opposite of life will unfold according to God's will. Society is saying, forget about God's will, this is society's will, and you should conform to society's will and produce an outcome that is in line with society's will. And so society's will, the promoting of you should be in such a way that delivers society's will, or the exclamation, this is society's will for life to look a certain way, is the opposite of the deeply ingrained understanding life will turn out as it's destined to turn out in the next moment, which is a happening according to God's will, meaning a happening according to the unfolding of life, which is really a force dictated to by variables outside of variables that you and I are in control of, outside of variables that society are in control of. So this notion that you should behave a certain way, I should behave a certain way, life should turn out a certain way, is a reinforcing of the attitude of personal doership, and a non-reinforcement of the notion of life as a happening. So the other topic that I wanted to talk about today is linked in with what I've just said. But let's find the commonality, because it's important to see why are these two quite different topics. So one is, in each moment do exactly what you think or feel to do, which is really us moving away from shoulds and shouldn'ts to allowing life to live us and seeing how life will live us without this resistance to the natural flow. And that's important because it starts to diminish the attitude of personal doership on which so much of the suffering arises: the guilt, the blame and the pride, the expectation, and the worry. All of that is based on, it's my doing, and therefore I have to worry about the future because I think that I can affect it and prevent it from being problematic. I have to have expectations of the future if I think it's my doing and the other's doing, and wanting it therefore to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. If I function in a way that delivers pain to myself or someone that I care about, or even a stranger, then I have to hate myself for functioning in that way, functioning in a way that has delivered pain, which I see as my unhappiness. If the other delivers pain to me or to someone I care about, then I have to hate them for having delivered pain, which is an attack on my happiness. And all of that is, all of that guilt and shame, blame and hatred, pride for those actions that happen through me that deliver positive outcomes. And then I say, look at what I have achieved. All of that attitude is based on the notion I'm doing it, and it isn't an unfolding outside of my control or outside of your control. So this other topic is linked in to seeing there is no doer, but it's reinforcing that from a different exploration. And this was inspired by a one-on-one session I was having with someone. And their feedback was, the last week has been, really quite predominantly a flop. The flop energy, the feeling lost in the uncomfortableness, not having any perspective, not being able to witness life happening, not finding themselves in a position where when the other delivers pain, they feel like, well, actually, who cares? It's not that big a deal. So their narration of their last week was, I was heavily involved in what the other did that was delivering a circumstance that I didn't like, whereas in previous weeks I was able to think, well, it's actually not touching who I am at my core. And so when they were describing this, I was thinking, getting a sense of, okay, so how do we look at this. And I generally look at what is it in my experience, what perspective is there that prevents that suffering from forming. And in this particular instance, what occurred to me is that it's very clear from where I stand that different feelings, what is felt, what in our experience is a feeling or a thought of uncomfortableness, or for that matter peace or excitement or grumpiness, is intrinsic in the present moment. What that means is that it is woven into the experience, into the present moment experience. And why that is clear to me in a way that it doesn't waver is because the whole, or any life experience, meaning, so when I talk about life experience, I'm not talking about those memorable experiences. I'm talking about the fact that there is a sense of existence in a world at any point in time. So when you're, waking up and getting out of bed and going to the bathroom, there is an awareness of a world, of a room, of a person, getting out of a bed and walking through a room, and that experience, essentially, we can describe it as being a collage or a combination of various sense objects. So there's the visual field, there's the sound, there's touch, there's smell, there's taste, there's thoughts, there's emotions, and within the visual field there is a visual of the body as well as the rest of the world, the rest of the room. In the sense of touch, that links in with the visual of the body. There is apparent boundaries of the body, and if we bump into the door, we can feel that door on the body. And so the whole combination of all of the senses create the impression of an objectively real person in an objectively real world. And until it becomes really clear that each moment of what we can call the daily life experience, until it's really clear that each moment is actually a subjective experience, a subjective, that's the word, a subjective experience. Now it's up to the seeker to hear that and say, what does that mean? What is a subjective experience? Now I suggest it's important, if you aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, like that the whole of daily life, each moment of daily life, is a subjective experience. Now, so I suggest it's important to ask yourself, what does that mean? And I'll do my best to make that clear. It's a subjective experience that feels like, and feels basically means is experienced as, an objective world. Now, because it is a subjective experience that is designed to be experienced like or as if it is an objective person in an objective world, because it's designed to be experienced like that, and it is experienced like that, it is then assumed that that is the reality, that that is what's going on. And we've had that manifestation of daily life, this subjective experience, ever since we were conceived or born, not necessarily conceived, but once at a certain point we can say that there is an awareness of a world developing. And let's just make it simple, from the age of 2 or 1 or whatever, there is an experience of a world, sights and sounds, and then a sense of self develops, and thinking develops, and language develops. And so once you're at age 4 or 5, it's fairly developed, and then at age 10 it's more developed. At age 20 it's changing, it's always changing. But we've had this subjective experience. That's all we've ever had from, I won't say quite the moment of conception. It probably didn't exist at the moment of conception. It started at some point when the body-mind organism was developed enough. That's all we've had, is a subjective experience of life. The key here is that the subjective experience is a subjective experience designed to be experienced as an objective reality. And because we've had this subjective experience that is designed to feel like an objective reality for our whole life, the assumption, the unquestioned assumption is that is reality. Reality is an objective being in an objective world. And why would I think anything other than that? Because that's how it feels. So the trick, the key in what I'm saying is it is a subjective experience designed to feel like, to be experienced as an objective reality. Objective reality just means it feels like what we are in is an objective world. Now, the non-dual teachings that I hope people who listen often enough realize that I have a great respect for the non-dual teachings. I think that they are full of wisdom, and as teachings, they are, as I see it, a methodology that is designed to solve certain problems, to bring about certain, or to achieve certain objectives. And they do that by understanding deeply what the problem is. And that's why I have a respect for a methodology that solves a problem. Because in order for a methodology to solve a problem, it has to understand the problem, and it has to understand the solution to the problem. In fact, it has to create a solution to the problem. Because at some point, the problem existed and the teaching didn't. And then a teaching was developed to address the problem based on an understanding of the problem and an understanding of a process that worked for whoever put the teaching in place. And so there are many teachings. They use sometimes slightly differing methodologies, sometimes radically different methodologies. We can say about any teaching that that is accurate from a certain perspective relative to a certain objective, and we can say about any teaching that it is not absolutely true. In fact, some of the teachings we can say it is not very true at all, not very accurate, and because the objective might not be accuracy, the objective might be change. The fact that teaching isn't what we might call accurate can be absolutely irrelevant to its efficacy or its value. So, what I'm going to talk about here is two things related to this topic of life being a subjective experience. And why is that important? And why is it that if we don't see that and realize it deeply, that, or why, rather, I'll put it the other way, why is it that if we see that, it can be an extremely significant part of dissolving the psychological me that is the foundation of suffering? And remember, all of these talks are essentially about peace of mind in daily living. And peace of mind, which is described as the human happiness that is available. Peace of mind means the end of suffering. So because the objective of these talks, or the topic of these talks, is happiness in daily living, which turns out to be unbroken peace of mind in daily living, which turns out to be the absence of suffering in daily living, then this is what we need to ask. Why is it that we're talking about this subjective experience? And the answer is because when that is seen, and when it's seen, it's a big realization. Because remember, the subjective experience is designed to, on the surface, feel like an objective reality. And when it clicks that, oh my God, this is, life has always been. And when I say life, we're really, and people have a different idea of what we mean by life. If someone is convinced that the subjective experience is an objective reality, when I say life is, they're processing it as the objective world out there is, whatever, because that's what life is to them, an objective world. For someone else, life, or the experience of life, means the subjective experience. So when it's deeply seen that what has always seemed like an objective reality is in fact a subjective experience arising in consciousness, or arising in awareness, a subjective experience arising in what we could call mind, universal mind, the mind of God, that's a huge revelation. That starts to allow us to get a glimpse, or to start hearing concepts like the world is an illusion, or the world is not real, or nothing ever happened. We will then be able to hear those concepts relative to a completely different frame of reference, our own personal revealed realization about the subjective nature of life, or the subjective nature of our experience of life, as opposed to our previously solidified sense of life as an objective reality. So there's a big contrast between the two. And what we're forced to do is hear the teaching concepts relative to our frame of reference. And so if our frame of reference of life is an objective reality, the notion that life is an illusion, that life is not as it seems, that nothing ever happened, that suffering is not real, that everything is nothing, or everything is made of consciousness. All of those concepts are, they're concepts. They're like, I hear what's being said, but I've got no idea what it really means. I definitely don't have any experiential understanding of it. It could be what we are saying if life is experienced as that subjective experience is designed to be, i.e., as if life is an objective reality, then that seeker is being honest when they say, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know what you mean. And so when I was talking to this person recently in a world, I asked, I said, is it clear to you that the suffering, the uncomfortable feeling, the feeling of what someone has said to you being very personal, is it clear that that is an arising or contained in the momentary experience, and that there is no one doing that or no one feeling that, but rather there is a subjective experience of life, which is what's always there, and in that moment there is pleasure or pain, uncomfortableness, excitement, flatness, and there isn't someone feeling flat. It feels like there is someone feeling flat, but is it clear to you that the sense of someone and the flatness are one arising along with the room in which the person seems to be appearing, that the whole thing is a singular arising and that there is no one doing it? Because if we have that appreciation, then even the uncomfortableness or any other feeling, maybe irritation, that we might have become attached to or involved in, identified with, can be seen as, oh, this is the present moment forming or having formed in this particular way. And it's not personal. There is no person. There is just a subjective experience arising. So I said that, and quite honest, being honest, the lady said, I don't know what you're talking about. Because that was her experience in that moment. Now, at a different time, on another week, she does know what I'm talking about. The experience is different and the perspective is different. And as I said, because she was being honest with her own experience and not just running with a concept. She says, in this moment, I just don't feel that. This last week, I haven't felt that. What does that mean? Okay, good. So we're touching on a problem in a sense, or I listened to what she was saying, and I heard. So, what is it that allows this the suffering to be less intense, for it to be witnessed, for there to be a non-involvement in it? And I decided to take this approach of, I think that if we can keep reinforcing for ourselves, if the movement of our seeking turns into seeing more and more that life and the sense of self and the individual is all part of a subjective arising and not part of a objective reality, then the suffering gets less and less very quickly when that perspective comes in. So I thought, okay, let's work on that. So we got to a bit of a stumbling point where I described it, and she said, if I'm honest with how I feel now, no, I've got no idea that the uncomfortableness or the grumpiness or the excitement, the peace, the whole experience of the world is a subjective arising in the present moment. So I thought, okay, how do we address this? So what about the chair or the table? What is the table to you? Well, the table's a table. It's an object. Okay. Now we're getting somewhere. So it becomes evident that the world is being seen, felt, experienced as an objective reality, right? The question, what is the table, sounds like such a odd question. What is the table to you? It's like, what sort of question is that? The table is a table. It's, made of wood and it's squarish or rectangle-ish. Is that what you mean? Yes, no, that's not exactly what I meant, but your answer is fantastic. Your answer tells us where we need to go. So we're trying to demonstrate here, what does it mean that life is a subjective appearance or a subjective experience? The non-dual teachings take the perspective of dealing with this topic in a very impressive and particular way. So what they do is they assert what reality is. The table is not real. So I'm going to take the perspective of a typical top-down explanation that will be reinforced over and over and over again each time the seeker enters into the teaching. This is the description that is being delivered. Life is not what it seems. The world is not real. The table is not real. There is no person. All there is consciousness. Life is an illusion. There is no table. There is nothing outside of consciousness. The table is made of consciousness or awareness. The table is made of awareness. Awareness is source or God. The table is therefore made of source or made of God. Everything is made of God, made of source, made of awareness. Nothing is real. Everything is apparently happening. The only thing that is real is the self. You are the self. You are the awareness in which the whole appearance of life arises. The experience of the world of form is simply images coming and going on the background of awareness. All there really is awareness. Those images are not separate from awareness, and they are made essentially of awareness. The images or the appearance of the world is arising in consciousness, in awareness, and is therefore made of and witnessed by awareness itself. And remember, God is awareness. There is nothing outside of awareness. Nothing exists outside of awareness. In the absence of your awareness of the table, it doesn't exist. The table doesn't exist outside of awareness, and in fact, even within awareness, the table as a table doesn't really exist. The table exists as an appearance. The table is really just made of awareness. So that is what the top-down non-dual teaching will keep reminding us of about the nature of reality, about the nature of the world. It will tell us that there is no time. Time is an illusion. There is no space. Space is an illusion. There is no past and there is no future. There is just the present moment. The present moment is all that is spontaneously arising in awareness, made of awareness, witnessed by awareness. All of that is arising according to the will of Source. That Source is bringing, or awareness as Source, as God, is bringing this present moment, this happening, this spontaneous arising into existence as its creation, as an imagination in the mind of God, as an imagination in the field of awareness. An imagination basically means that the universal mind creates through imagination. We could say it thinks the world into existence, but in the use of the word, it thinks the world into existence. It doesn't mean thinking in the word-based idea of thoughts, but in the imagination idea of thought. So if you're daydreaming, that maybe you can see that as a form of thought, a form of mind movement, mind creation. So mind in movement is manifestation. So all of this is a manifestation of Source. And Source is awareness, and the manifest is the apparent form that is actually formless. Now, I don't want to just keep making statements, but I'm putting forward the statements so that we might be able to investigate and see for ourselves that maybe that's true. Now, if we keep reinforcing our assumption of what reality is, we can't see that, because what we'll then see every time we investigate the experience. Remember, for our whole life, the subjective experience has been a subjective experience specifically designed to be experienced as an objective reality. So deep down, we are convinced, not even on a conscious level in a way, that the table is real, is objectively real. Objectively means an object that is defined and somewhat independent and has its own existence. Subjective basically means that whatever is subjective has an existence dependent on the subject of it. So we are convinced that the world is an objective reality, means that the world has an objective existence outside of my awareness of it. And the teachings are telling us that your experience of life has always been and always will be and can only ever be a subjective experience, meaning that whatever you know of the world is completely dependent on your awareness of it. It ceases to exist outside of your awareness of it. Now, let me make this statement at this point in time, at the risk of blunting the tool, making the tool that I'm using blunt, that might prevent it from cutting. Let me make this statement. Whatever is said in a teaching is a concept and not the truth. Whatever has been written down in the past, whatever has been spoken in the past, is a concept. Any teaching from the past, the present, or one that exists in the future is a set of concepts and not the truth. They are pointers. They are descriptions that are trying to point our seeing in a certain direction. So we have become completely convinced, which means there is no scope for anything other than to interpret the world that we know as an objective reality. Now remember, the non-dual teachings are telling us the world is an illusion. The world is not real. It is a subjective experience arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness. So how do we see this? How do we know what that means? So let's look at the table, because our friend the table is the subject of this exploration. This table that is supposedly real, that we know only as an objective reality, as an object outside of us. That's our experience. That we go, the door is an object outside of us. The other is an object outside of us. The cars are objects outside of us that have independent existence. If we go to sleep, they continue to be there. That's our assumption. That's the general assumption in life. And our sense of self, the sense of self that flowers into uncomfortableness, which is our unhappiness, our human unhappiness, is very much linked in with this understanding, or rather misunderstanding, of the nature of life. So the table is known as an object, and when we look at what that object is, we see it's a visual experience. And if, let's say, it was a rocking chair, it's a visual experience, and the visual is of the chair moving, or of a moving chair. And let's say it squeaks when it moves, so there's a sound component to the chair. And let's say you were touching the chair as it's rocking and squeaking. So there is a visual component, there is a sense of touch, and there is a sense of sound that is all contributing to the experience of the chair. Now remember, we are convinced that the chair is an objective reality and we are experiencing it. Actually, we don't even have the notion of experiencing it. We just know that there is the experience of the chair, that's undeniable, but we don't think of it as an experience of the chair. We just see there is a chair out there, and because there's a chair out there, it has to be known by me as being there. Now, I've described the chair and the table as being essentially a large part of our life experience is a visual component. We know the table as a visual. Remember, as we have to dive into the experience, because on the surface it seems a certain way, and that way is such that it convinces us that it is an objective reality? How are we to see it's a subjective experience? So if you were to close your eyes, is there a table? Remembering that you know the table based on a conglomeration of, essentially, when we look at it, senses. Visual is a large component of what makes up our knowing of the world. Sound, taste, smell, touch. So when you close your eyes, is there a table? Now, based on our assumption of how life is, based on how life has been presenting itself moment after moment after moment for 20, 40, 60, 80 years, we have come to assume, because it's how it presents, that the table is an objective reality. So if I don't point out that you know the table in this moment based on senses, if I don't point that out, then we have this idea the table is an independent object. So close our eyes. I have pointed out that it's our knowing of the table is based on the senses, and so I ask you, is there a table? And it would make sense that you go, well, of course, there is a table. It's there. It's in the room. I was just looking at it, and I have closed my eyes, so I can't see it. But there is a table. So I say, how much of that answer is based on you bringing in an assumption, a belief about how the world works, what the world is? Remember, the non-dual teachings have said the world is not real. The world is an appearance in consciousness. The world doesn't exist. Nothing has independent existence outside of your awareness of it. Everything is an appearance in consciousness. So I then ask you again, is there a table? And you might notice how a residual self-image can make its way in to what essentially is a new experience that replaces the experience of the world that was there before what we call closing our eyes happened. So there is an experience of daily life. In this moment, it's a room with plants, light, table, chairs, people. That's the experience that we assume is an objective reality because that's how life has presented. If we bring our attention into the present moment with this, with what's here, and then what we call closing our eyes happens, and we say, now, don't bring in your assumption of how life works. In fact, maybe follow the pointers of the non-dual teachings that tell us actually life is really quite different in nature from how we have come to know it. And be present with the experience as it is now, not bringing in any assumptions into the experience that create a certain sense. The assumptions, which are deeply ingrained beliefs, can create a sense of the world that can fall away if the assumption is held as, well, I don't know. So now, when you look at the experience of the world, you find that, well, with what we call eyes closed, and without bringing in a residual self-image of the world, which really means a residual self-image of who I am based on my accumulated experience from the past. So our residual self-image means that with our eyes closed, there is a whole unconscious set of stimuli saying, I am a human being in an objective world with my eyes closed. I am sitting on a chair in a room that is a room in a house in a country that is here whether I'm here or not. And I return to it each night after going out to work, and each night I find it is where I left it. And so it has to have an independent existence. So if we don't bring that understanding of life in, and we are present with the present moment experience as it is presenting right now, and my present moment experience, if I narrate it from what experience I have, there is no body, there is no room, there is no world, there are no people, there is an undeniable sense of existence. There is an awareness of that sense of existence. There is awareness of a formless space in which sound is arising and subsiding. Awareness of a formless space with no boundaries, no time, no space, no edges. And if attention is brought into that space that is the present moment, as if looking at a tree, but instead looking forward into this space, and we realize there is this vast, empty, black whiteness. And there is no person, there is no body, and yet there is an undeniable sense of existence. And if one's thinking has been seen to be objects arising in the present moment, and if that thinking has become less habituated, less consistent, less continuous, then in this space of essentially the absence of daily living, what we could say, depending on how that experience is presenting itself, we could call it a meditation experience. So in that meditation space, if the thinking subsides, then what can take center stage is this sense of being. and realizing that that sense of being exists without the presence of a body, at least without the experience of a body. Is there a table? Unless we believe there's a table. Is there a table in your experience? No. Is there a table? Well, if all that exists is the subjective experience, then the answer is no, because if I go to the subjective experience, it's absolutely sure there is no table in my current subjective experience. So if we are specific about saying, is there an experience of a table? Is there the subjective experience of a table? The answer is no. So once again, to the question, is there a table? If that means, is there a subjective experience of a table, we have to say no. We have to look at the subjective experience, and there is no table. Now, is there actually a table outside of the subjective experience? The non-dual teachings tell us there isn't. We used to believe that there was. So we used to believe, with my eyes closed, there was a table. If we check out our experience for ourselves, we find there is no subjective experience of a table. There is no experience of the table. We can believe the non-dual teachings and say, because there is no subjective experience, there is no table. Maybe there is a table and we just don't have the subjective experience of it. If that's the case, it doesn't matter. If we go to the subjective experience, there is no table. There is no subjective experience of the table. To appreciate the subjective experience, it sometimes takes us or needs us to assume that nothing exists outside of the subjective experience. So in Zen, there is a koan, and the koan is, if a tree falls in a forest and there is no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? And what that is trying to get the seeker to, what the koans are tests, essentially, to test where the seeker is, to see where the seeker is in their understanding. So if the koan is put forward, a seeker that has come to see that a tree doesn't exist unless I am aware of it, at least as far as the subjective experience of the tree. And the seeker might appreciate that their experience of life, they have only ever known life as a subjective experience of life. So then it might click that life, as they have known it, doesn't exist except when there is awareness of life. So this is challenging, this notion that if a tree falls in a forest and there is no one there to hear it, does it fall? Does it make a sound when it falls? If a tree falls in a forest and there is no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Now, if someone is not a seeker and they just hear the question, it's like, what a stupid question. That's meant to be a trick. That's meant to be a hard question. Of course it makes a sound, because we're applying our assumed understanding of the world as an objective reality. And so it's like a big, heavy tree hits the ground, which is an object. The tree is an object. Two objects hit, there's going to be sound. So from the standard perspective, it's yes, the tree makes a sound when no one is there to hear it. Now, obviously, you can ask yourself if that is a koan in the Zen tradition. It can't be that. It can't be like that. Or at least the koan is looking for a different answer. And the Zen master will understand that the student gets it not just because they give a technically correct answer, but it's how the answer is delivered, through what means the answer is delivered, that there can be that the master can see whether the seeker really understands or not. So I haven't been schooled in Zen, but I thought about this for a long time. And so, and I thought about if I was being asked, this is like when I was seeking and seeing life and insights revealing, I would imagine having conversations, let's say with the Zen master, and thinking about the koan. And at some point it occurred to me, it's like, if there is no one there to be aware of it, does the forest exist? Does the tree exist to fall, let alone the sound? So if that was my response that came out when the koan is asked, the master might go, that may be an answer that is considered an answer to demonstrate a degree of understanding from the student. So going back to the non-dual teachings, they tell us nothing exists outside of consciousness. And that might be necessary as a concept. So when the seeker realizes that the whole experience of life is a subjective experience arising in their consciousness, that as soon as the visual of the table is gone, do I know that the table exists? And so, it can suddenly dawn on us. In a moment of seeing, we see, I've assumed, I've come to believe, I have a concept that the table is real. That's the concept. The table exists independent of my awareness of it. It's a concept. And we see, I have believed it, and therefore, when it is believed, when my eyes are closed and someone were to ask me, does the table exist? It's like, of course the table exists. I just have my eyes closed and it's there. As soon as the point is seen, and it's like, unless I'm aware of the table, in my experience, it definitely doesn't exist. And does it exist right now? outside of my experience, previously we said yes. Now we might believe the teachings and say, no, it doesn't exist. When we really define the layers clearly, we might say, in my experience, it doesn't exist. Whether it independently exists, I don't know. So that's an extra step from previously, yes, it exists, no question about it. Then once the teachings that tell us it doesn't exist, nothing exists outside of awareness, nothing exists outside of consciousness, and they say that for good reason, because that helps us to see the subjective nature of what we've always assumed to be an objective reality. And they've said, you've always thought the world exists outside of who you are, of what you are. The body is not what you are. You are the field of awareness. The body is just another object, like the table. Close your eyes. Does the body exist? Are your eyes even closing? Or is that just what it appears like? With what we know as closed eyes, if you are not the body, if the body maybe doesn't exist, who are you? What are you? Awareness is all there is. Awareness can't go anywhere. So with eyes closed, the subjective layer of visual experience falls away. With what we call eyes closed, the experience is an experience of no visual elements. And yet awareness is there fully. Sound is still arising. Thought may still be arising. Some form of visual might arise and we realize, oh, well, visual is arising in awareness. It's not necessarily visual seen by eyes. And then we question what we call opening eyes. Is that really the opening of eyes and seeing an external world, or is that the flooding in onto a space of empty awareness, flooding in of the manifestation of thought in that mind? As the subjective nature of the experience of life becomes clearer and clearer, hopefully meditation becomes more interesting. Meditation becomes a potential to explore what is really here when I don't bring in, or when the experience of life doesn't bring in a residual self-image, doesn't bring in the idea I am a physical body in a physical world, doesn't bring in the assumption that there is time, there was a past, and there is a future. What am I? What remains? What is the notion of time? We might see it as a thought. It is a memory of a past. It is an assumption and a conceptualizing of a future that will happen. And if it's seen that those are thought objects that have a very specific power and effect on how the experience is painted, you could say, then what is described as the illusion of life starts to be seen. What we then might appreciate is the sense of who I am, the person, the individual, is in fact a whole lot of layers of a visual of the body, a visual of a body relative to the visual of a room, the sense of touch of a boundary of the body, a sense of smell and taste, a sense of existence that seems to be arising within the structure of the body, that is aware of an external world. And all of this can be flipped as we start exploring, especially with eyes closed, the subjective nature of life, and realize that this sense of being a body in an objective world is just the way that the experience is designed to be experienced because of the placing of so many different objects: body objects, thought objects, emotions, the sense of existence, awareness, what seems like the external world and the others, pleasure and pain. And I would suggest that the oneness experiences that happen, especially as life starts to be appreciated as arising within a field of awareness rather than the human arising in an objective reality, as the alternate that I've been speaking about today is explored, and an appreciation of how this experience of life is actually arising within a field of consciousness that is ever present. Whenever there is the experience of daily living, there has to be the awareness of that. So the awareness is said to be primordial, primary, fundamental, intrinsic, and the changing subjective experience, the objects come and go. And as this changed perspective happens, the sense of separation starts to fall away, because life is not experienced as being a body experiencing a table outside of itself, but rather awareness, aware of an appearance of a body and a table and a chair, all arising as a single appearance designed to, from a specific perspective, be experienced as a world of objects, of separation. And even that oneness experience, where separation falls away, is actually a subjective experience arising in consciousness, designed to be experienced as a oneness experience where the subjective nature of experience is more evident. So what did we have before? We had a subjective experience designed to be experienced as an objective reality. And as with all of life, life is change, and what is known as awakening is a subjective experience recognized because of how it is designed in that moment to be experienced as a subjective experience, more appreciated as a subjective experience, rather than a subjective experience forced to be known as an objective reality. Now, what are we looking for in life? Are we looking for oneness? I say not. So what was all of this about? This was about an exploration into the nature of life, seeing how, or challenging our notion of how life is, which can be a significant undermining of the notion of who I am. Because as life is seen to be different, the body, the thoughts, the emotions can be witnessed, can be awared, can be investigated from a perspective of knowing all of the subjective experience to be components arising as imagination in the mind of God, we could say. And even that, remember, is something that further down the track, as that realization, that awakening is explored and as certain misunderstandings fall away, then even the notion of all of life arising in the mind of God might be refined to then be described as maybe something a bit different. And ultimately, I say what this is all about is peace of mind and daily living. That's what a seeker is really interested in, whether they realize it or not. They might consciously, at a certain point, be convinced that what they are looking for is truth, or what they are looking for is oneness. Yes, that might be those might be significant methodologies or objectives that are important. Ultimately, what we need to remember is, if we keep it practical, all we really want is to be able to wake up in life and live life free of uncomfortableness with oneself, and appreciating life as a subjective arising. That's all it can ever be, a subjective arising that is designed to feel like an objective reality, means that our attitude, our seeing of the uncomfortableness, the pleasure, the pain, the outcomes, can be seen within the framework or within the context of life as a happening, life as a experience changing all the time. That's why the transient nature of life is so often emphasized. That's why life is described as relative, why all form is described as changing and unreal, and why consciousness or awareness, that which we truly are, is described as the absolute, to try and bring a perspective that appreciates the change, being the world of form, the experiences, the emotions, the thoughts, and that which is aware of everything that arises inside of it. Okay, so we'll just take 3 questions. There's 3 hands up. Hi, Rajiv. Hello.
I have just one question.
Okay.
I want to ask you that what is the connection between reality and peace of mind?
Well, is there reality? What is reality? So if we're going to answer that question, we have to ask that sort of question. What is reality? If we look at the context of today's talk, really what it says is all that we ever have of life, all that life is a subjective experience. Now, the very word subjective is the opposite of absolute, and reality would be aligned much more with something unchanging, something absolute. What was described today is that our experience of life is a subjective reality. That's all it ever is. Now, I know that in the non-dual teachings, they talk about the absolute, pointing at the awareness that is aware of the subjective. But as that understanding deepens, we don't create a distinction between the awareness and the objects of awareness. They are seen to be one. And if the objects are said to be changing, then the awareness also, if it is not separate from the objects, is not unchanging. And similarly, someone could say, well, what is it? What if the awareness is unchanging, and therefore what appears to be change is not change. And I'd be happy with either of those point of views. I think it's both, not one or the other. So from that point of view, I would say I don't know of any reality. What I know is there's a subjective experience of life. Any search for truth that I might have had has fallen away because there's a realization that actually I can't know truth. The experience of life is always subjective, and truth is not subjective. Truth is absolute. So I see that the search for truth, the fruit of that, of searching for truth, is the realization that there is no truth that I can know. And so then we're left with peace of mind. And I say that if we keep it practical, the seeker is, we say, I am, and I am finding myself consistently in what appears to be a world of form. Now, I said appears to be, because we still need to live the rest of our life as if life is as it appears, at least on one level. Even if we say it's all a subjective experience, it doesn't mean that within the subjective experience that the human body can move through walls, for example. That's not how it works. If you run at a wall, the body will bang into it, and you'll have to reassess your assessment of life, at least on the level of the practical daily living. So then we're left with peace of mind. And peace of mind is the absence of suffering. And when that has set in, then we say, actually, all I was after is, in this subjective experience of life, is for the subjective experience of life to be free of the uncomfortableness with oneself. And when that happens, then we find we aren't seeking anything. We just allow life to unfold, finding ourselves at peace. So I haven't really, I guess I haven't answered the question as it was posed, but I hope that it becomes clear that from my perspective, there is no reality that I can know. There is only daily life as it presents itself as an objective, as a subjective, or known as a subjective experience that I have to live on some level as an objective reality. And peace of mind is, according to the concept I'm putting forward, what we are really seeking, because when peace of mind is there, life is acceptable.
Your teachings have been a great help to me.
Thank you, Rajiv. I'm glad to hear that. That's, well, I think that's very fortunate for anyone that is changed by these sort of teachings. Ramesh used to say, we must be God's favorites. Hi, Lupe. You have to unmute yourself, Lupe. I can't.
Okay, I hadn't unmuted myself.
Okay, good.
I realized why I fell off the mountain.
Oh,
And
yes.
it's because I had made Dave's sister-in-law, other than like you said, the table is an object. But for some reason, I had made her other than an object.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Because the person isn't any different than the object, right? I mean, it's still a subjective experience of somebody I call a sister-in-law, correct?
Yes, that's right.
So I'm really thankful that I it dawned when you were talking, actually, is when I realized my peace of mind was taken because I was giving it more importance than the table. I know it sounds kind of like strange to equate a person like a table, but in truth, we make it more important or not, and so it robs us of our peace of mind.
I think you're spot on. Yes.
Okay.
If we attribute a whole lot of characteristics to the person, i.e., starting off by seeing them as objectively real, and then we project onto them personal doership and agency and how they should act and how they shouldn't act and how life should be treating them and how all of these things. So as soon as we see them according to our old view of them, or our old view of life, then a whole narrative that is supported by our presuppositions about what life is and what the other person is, all of those presuppositions allow this narrative of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation to kick in. And as soon as we've realized that that is suffering and that's because we're not relating to ourself and life in the way that can happen, as soon as that suffering is seen and we then come back to seeing the present moment, and included in that is a sister-in-law or a partner or whatever, as an appearance, as part of the subjective experience, and not, a doer with agency and separate from the experience, and realize that they are appearing inside our experience of life, then that presence, essentially, because that's what's happening, we're coming back to the presence with life as an experience, with life coming, we're being present with life as a arising that is changing and being experienced. Then what happens is the thinking mind is disarmed, because we're looking at the table without labeling it as objectively real and a nice table or not. We're just allowing it to be. And presence is aware of it, but the thinking mind has quietened down. And we see that so much of our suffering is this story based on seeing ourself as the doer, the other as the doer, and our happiness in outcomes, and the other's happiness in outcomes. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Because the table, I didn't have any trouble with the table disappearing, but I was having trouble that she's going to die. And so I was freaking out until, you explained just now that it's not any different. It's our subjective experience, whether it's a table or a person or the bird or your cat that dies. It all comes and goes. It's life. So I'm really grateful, because I thought, how do I get back on the mountain? And it's easy. I just have to remember it's God's will when she disappears from my view, and that's just life. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Lupe. That's exactly right. So when we close our eyes and the table vanishes, and we're present with what's left, or what's here, then one of the things, a whole lot of things fall away, like visual images can fall away. We see that sounds come and go. We see that thoughts arise and emotions arise. And essentially all of these things that we can be aware of as coming and going get known as transient. And we're often being pointed to, okay, so what is it that doesn't come and go? What is it that is there as the background to everything that comes and goes. And eventually, we might land on the realization, I, not as I, the body or whatever, but I as the field of awareness in which everything comes and goes, is ever present and consistent. And we've been formed such that we relate to the external world, we relate to the cars and the people and the tables as if they define who I am. And so when we see a table disappear, like in the analogy, if we look at a family member or a friend and imagine them not there, we then sort of lose ourselves, because our image or how we know ourselves is intertwined with them being present. The more that we ground into this formless being aspect of ourselves and realize what I am at my core is always here, even when the table isn't, then the natural comings and goings of life, which includes, to some extent, unfortunately, but from another perspective, not unfortunately, but all part of life. It includes the passing away of people we love. Hopefully we've got a groundedness in this part of ourself that we've realized and grounded into that doesn't change, isn't affected by the comings and goings of life.
Right. Yeah, I see it today, but 2 weeks ago I was freaking out.
Good. Well,
so thank you again. You have no idea how much you have helped me. Like I said, if I had $1 million, I would write the check right now.
Thank you.
I love you so.
Thank you, Lupe. That's very kind of you. Nice to hear. Hello, Akshay.
So previously I'd come to the conclusion that, similar to today's discussion, that the world of objects doesn't have its own reality. Rather, it's through perception that objects arise. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of stuck at a point where I was trying to reconcile how my consciousness, this feeling of I am, is the same as the reality underlying what we call the world. But while you were talking, that kind of distinction fell apart, and it became clear that it was just a mental concept of there being a difference between my beingness and the world's beingness. And in terms of experience, there's no separation. And mm-hmm. It kind of, and then what happened was my mind tried to conceptualize it. Okay, if there's no separation, then it tried to like formulate a picture of awareness of like being close. And I just realized that the mind couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, more of a comment than a question, but I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's great to see past our conceptual distinctions, which is what I hear you describing now, is a great realization. Because when we describe things conceptually, they are described by default because words and concepts are a dualistic mechanism. When we think about things conceptually, the concept has an inherent separation in it. And then, we might think, oh, well, concepts are a problem. And they can be because of this dualistic nature of them. But they can also be a pointer to see beyond the way we are seeing, and then maybe even drop into a place where the concept becomes irrelevant. And as you said, the mind of concepts can't actually know oneness because the mind of concepts is inherently dualistic. But if that contemplating inspired by the dualistic concepts, leads to a realization the mind can't know it, and then it's just a stop and a being, and it's like, then then it's very, very significant. So what you described as the recognition that the concepts can only take us so far is very important.